Say you're trying to get into a house, you put in multiple offers, no luck. What would you tell someone watching this? What do they need to do to get that home?
There are an abundance of things that you can do in the process of writing an offer when you're in a multiple offer situation. The first one is to be as fully prepared and organized as you possibly can be. And that is, and I'm going to say this first and foremost, and obviously being a realtor, this is how I think, but you want a team that's going to work for you. So the realtor that you enlist, you want that realtor to have been through this process more than once, and be seasoned enough to know to be proactive and or to be able to overcome any issues that pop up on the horizon, because they do. Inevitably, there's no transaction that's perfect. So you get that. So that whole process, an agent with documentation and with all of the nuances that go into a multiple offer situation, you want that type of an individual. But you also want a lender that's going to be, and I say this, you want your lender to be local. Someone who knows the area, that is tied in with the appraisal process and understands, how to work the process to make sure that things go smoothly. Not to do things that are not necessarily ethical. That happened in 2007. That's why we tanked. But just to make sure that they see all of these things coming to and help a buyer through the process of getting that loan. And when people have online lenders, there's definitely pushback from the seller and or their agent, because there's really no accountability and the communication is limited. And there's nobody you can sit down in front of to have a conversation about how things are going. So that local lender plays into that as much as having, everything else in place. But when a buyer writes an offer, the down payment, and I mentioned this earlier, the down payment is really critical. And of course, your hands are kind of tied if you only have 5% down. With that said, I've had buyers that have 5% down and they still got their deal accepted, because there's everything else that comes into play that you can write to benefit the seller. The other would be, how much time does the seller need in the house after they have closed on the transaction? Because as much as it is the seller's market, that seller has to buy. So now they're in a complicated situation. So if they have their house closed, they don't go to the table on their purchase with a house to sell, and they have the cash in the bank. And in addition, you give them some period of time to actually possess the property while they're waiting for their closing. And what's really interesting, there's the dominoes effect. The buyer is giving the seller time to give the other seller time, and that seller may need to give their seller time. It's just, that's how the process works. So the timeline can be anywhere from a week to just less than 2 months. Lenders will not allow more than 2 months, because it becomes a non-owner occupied or a rental property, so to say. So those are some of the things. The other is just tightening your timelines. There are some lenders who can close a transaction in 21 days. They tell you that. So the tighter the timeline for your financing, for your inspections, buyers will, as I mentioned earlier, will offset the appraisal if the appraisal comes in low. They'll say that in the offer. Buyers will take some responsibility for significant repairs that might come up on the inspection. As much as they can do to put the seller in a position of little to no risk. And the only thing that I would suggest not doing is to waive your inspection, because that raises a lot of other issues. I mean, you have your inspections and you can walk away from it. If you know that the sewer is a problem, if there's a leaking oil tank, if the roof is shot, there's some big ticket items that you as the buyer do not want to get into as your financial responsibility, unless you're that type of buyer who is, buying it to remodel it and you've got deep pockets. But that's not the buyer I'm talking about. I'm talking about the general public right now. And that's where it's really complicated. And I would never recommend waiving that particular contingency.